Poor Tasmania. You get such a bad rep from the mainlanders. Hopefully this video can explain a little bit more about you.
A history of Tasmania.
It's down the bottom.
Tasmania is an unusual place, even for Australia, which is famous for being unusual. It has mountains that look Nordic, waters that look tropical, towns that look English, and animals that look adorable, but are psychotic.
See, growing up, the only thing I knew about Tasmania was the Tasmanian Devil. But not the actual Tasmanian Devil. The cartoon from Looney Tunes, Tasmanian Devil. That is all I knew about Tasmania.
It's unique because it's separated from the rest of Australia by Bass Strait. But it wasn't always like that. Around 25,000 years ago, Tasmania was still part of the mainland because the Ice Age was happening. And of course it wasn't called Tasmania back then. We don't know what it was called because there were dozens of different languages in that part of the world and nobody wrote anything down. But they did go there, even though it was really cold and there were glaciers and giant animals. Then the glaciers melted and the oceans rose and it became an island around 12,000 years ago.
I tell you what, that's not a long time for that to change. That's not that long ago. Normally think millions of years to make these changes, but that's such a short period of time.
The big animals died out, and the small animals got on with evolving into the cartoon characters we know and love today. The people who were here called the land Troena. They separated up into different tribes in different parts of the island, and that worked for thousands of years. Then in 1642, a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman saw the island and named it Van Diemen's Land.
Imagine if Tasmania was still called Van Diemen's Land. Just imagine if that was still the case. You would get even more abuse, I'm sure.
Van Diemen's Land, because there was a fellow who ran the Dutch East Indies Company called Anthony Van Diemen. And it's never a bad career move to name places after powerful people. But of course you can't just name an island Anthony. The Dutch didn't come back, but they kept the European naming rights. So when the English showed up in 1803 and settled some people here, they kept the name. In a good career move, the local commander named the town Hobart, after a fellow called Lord Hobart, who was Minister for War and the Colonies. Not making that title up, the English were dicks. They were...
That's true. That's true, the Pommies are dicks. Always want to conquer, always want land to be theirs. Just ask India.
Also super racist.
Yeah.
Some of them even had capes. They came in, took the land, and started shooting black men and kidnapping black women as sex slaves. The black people weren't too keen on this and started killing back. So in 1830, 2,000 soldiers and settlers formed a regiment called the Black Line, despite the fact it was made up entirely of white guys. They systematically moved to the settled parts of Tasmania with the aim of herding every black person here and then forcing them to stay there. Jesus. They eventually caught...
The British are assholes. I'm sorry. I've got no... I wasn't alive back then, so I can only apologise on their behalf.
Two old women who were too tired to run away. The settlers were also dicks to animals. When they saw the thylacine, they thought,
The what?
that animal might want to eat our sheep, so they put a bounty on it. It doesn't exist anymore. For a while, Van Diemen's Land was under control of Sydney, and the whole east coast of Australia was called New South Wales. But then the governor in Sydney was like, they're a whole separate island, they're 2 hours flying time from here, and planes won't be invented for another 100 years, so Van Diemen's Land...
Yeah, I love the thought. Yeah, planes aren't going to be invented for another 100 years. What do we do until then?
got its own governor. In order to get things done, he started bringing in convicts direct from England, building temples of horror here, and getting the convicts to do stuff like build roads and bridges and get PTSD. The government also managed to convince the remaining black people they wouldn't try to kill them anymore if they all moved to another smaller island. Faced with death or exile, the black people thought exile would be better.
How many times in history can the Brits ruin other people's lives? They did it over, well, not just the Brits, you had the Europeans then, but we had the same thing in the Americas, same thing North America, South America, in India, Africa. Which countries have the Brits not ruined?
Jesus.
Yeah.
Did anything good happen to these people? Meanwhile, free settlers in Hobart began advocating for the arts, so Van Diemen's Land was the first place in Australia to publish novels, get a Philharmonic Society, and a professional theatre. They also started work on this brewery. because everyone likes beer, and it seems classier if you produce it from a building that looks cool. It's also the first state to get compulsory state education and public transport. In 1856, they changed the name from Van Diemen's Land to Tasmania, which sounds both catchier and less Dutch. Meanwhile, Aboriginal populations are dwindling, and when the famous Truganini, resistance leader, outlaw, and general badass, dies in 1876, the governor casually looks around and says, "That's it, no more Tasmanian Aborigines." It's not true, but everybody wants to believe it, so they even start teaching it in schools. Go!
Oh, man. Does it not almost remind you of a certain Adolf? A certain guy with the first name Adolf? Oh, poor Tasmania. Poor Tasmania.
Gold is discovered. Trees are also discovered. They already knew they were there, but now they start exporting them. Train lines start sprouting up from everywhere to everywhere else, which is pretty cool because Tasmania is super hilly, and before that it took days to get anywhere. In 1910, somebody noticed that Tasmania gets a lot of rain. Australia is the driest continent on Earth, unless you count Antarctica, which doesn't have people on it, so we won't. Also, it's kind of cheating. It's made of frozen water, so we doubly don't. The Tasmanians hear about this thing called hydroelectricity, and it sounds pretty neat. So they start building hydroelectric dams everywhere. World War I starts in Europe. This might not seem like it should be a big deal to people on the other side of the world, but Britain gave Australia almost all of its white people, so Australia sides with Britain and helps them out. It goes well, except for all the dying, but technically Australia is on the winning side, so everyone is pretty happy about it. Except on Anzac Day, when we all agree to be sad in the morning. Tasmania spends the next 10 years...
I assume your Anzac Day is the same as our Remembrance Day.
Years being pretty prosperous, exporting gold and sheep and timber. Then the Depression hits. So Tasmania gets busy building public projects like roads, bridges, and of course dams. They even get a prime minister. He's wildly popular in his home state, not just because he's quite friendly and he looks like a koala.
Bearing in mind, now this is something I've learned obviously, but Tasmania isn't that small. Compared to say the UK, you know, it's amazing how Australia can almost be one identity, even though it is the size of Europe. And Europe has so many countries in. And that's a very simplified way of saying it, of course. But if you look at Tasmania, it's big enough to be its own country. And Tasmania seems like a lovely place, apart from all the Brits that have come and ruined it.
Too bad he dies. More dying, this time closer to home. A German ship even drops mines in the port of Hobart in 1940. Scary. Tasmania celebrates by starting the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, gifting generations of sport fans a plethora of choice on Boxing Day ever since. 1949, Enid Lyons, the widow of Joseph, becomes the first woman elected to federal parliament, even though she has 12 kids and broken hips. Because it turns out Tasmanian politicians are pretty badass. In the 1950s, Italian and German migrants come over because Europe still looks like this. They start cranking out amazing cheeses and wines and helping to build dams because that's what Tasmania does. Meanwhile, governments are declaring national parks till nearly half the state is parks. Everyone is pretty happy about this except the guys who build dams, so they basically ignore it. And everybody ignores them ignoring it till they decide to dam this place, which is both beautiful and in the middle of a national park. And the conservationists are like, no! And they start protesting. And the government is like, shut up. And they start arresting people for protesting.
You're under arrest. You're under arrest. You're under arrest.
And so the conservationists say, hey, rest of Australia, this sucks. And the rest of Australia has a good think about it and agrees, yes, it totally sucks.
See, sometimes the mainland can agree with Tasmania. Who would have thought?
And they hold their own protests. And the decision goes to the High Court. And the High Court agrees with the rest of Australia. And the conservationists are all like, yeah! And a conservationist even gets elected to Parliament. But he has to get out of prison first because Tasmanian politicians are badass.
Damn, it feels good to be a gangster.
Meanwhile, Aboriginal Tasmanians manage to convince the state government they still exist. And in the year 2000, Tasmania hosts a sorry day for all the terrible things done to black people. But they don't offer any land back. After that, a real estate agent from Hobart married some guy from Denmark, and you're all caught up.
Well, as I said, from what I've seen already, and even doing the VR video on the stadium in Tasmania, it looks an absolutely beautiful place. A bit cold, maybe more like the UK in temperature-wise, Brits really have screwed lots up, haven't they? Really, we have always want to conquer rather than be peaceful. Yeah, it's a funny one because I still don't know why the mainland thinks the way they do. I don't know. Let me know. Tasmania seems lovely. It really does, but it's obviously had some issues. Whether that's the Brits coming, whether it's Aboriginal people, whether it's racism, whether it's the politics. It's yeah. There's clearly maybe still a few issues there that I suppose is all around the world as well. But there's a little history of Tasmania, and really good video that actually. Nice humour. Well, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.